Welcome, everybody, to the second episode of the Corner Table Podcast, a podcast by world builders for world builders. We're still workshopping the tagline, but that's what we'll do for now. I am Xavier, and joining us today, we have Kevan.
Hello.
And also Breilen.
Hi.
Breilen doesn't get his own camera. Sorry, guys. Today, we're doing our second
I do get a couch.
You do get a couch.
There's that.
You are by nature separate. Now, that's separate. We'll say separate, but equal.
Sure.
But
let's not.
Oh, okay. Apparently Kevin's anti-equality. But no. So we're on the second episode today, and today we are going to be talking about storytelling versus world building. Where are the two separate? Where are they the same? What's the intersection? What's this war look like? That's what we're going to figure out today. And who wins? Who would win, storytelling or world building?
It's an interesting.
I mean, I'm on team world building, man. I can't tell a story to save my life, but man, you tell me to build a world. I'm all in it.
Now, how you deliver that world to the person who asked
terrible.
you? But up here it would be brilliant, and whatever notes, if you could explain them, they'd be brilliant. But with this in mind, there's a lot that goes into looking at storytelling versus world building, because there's a ton of intersection. There's a lot of world building that is directly made for the purpose of telling a story, and there is some vice versa. We're going to start out by talking about building a story to fit a world.
Yeah.
So,
which I'm interested, Kevan, you just kind of brought this up in terms of you're very comfortable building a world, but you also are working on storytelling. So is there any sort of process there that you go through as far as, cool, I've got this whole big world that I've contrived in my mind or on paper or however, and then how do you go about fitting a story into what you've already created world building wise?
So that's very difficult for me. What I tend to do is I then run a tabletop RPG in
There
that
you
setting
go.
and let the players make the story for me, so I don't have to do anything.
Sure.
I just say, hey, here's a bizarre of ideas, and somebody picks one up and they're like, oh, what's this? And I'm like, that is the most amazing thing ever. Would you like to buy it?
Sure.
There we go.
Yeah. It does seem like world building first and storytelling second fits the TTRPG space more than novel writing. However, a thought that I had as far as like world building is a lot of kind of the sci-fi fantasy epics that we have in novels are very, very in-depth world building wise, and also novels long. So you have to already have a pretty good chunk of your world building done prior to your first novel.
Like an example I would give, if people are familiar, it's way clear in books, like you said. It would be like Mistborn. I can't remember, Breilen. Have you read more than the first Mistborn book?
I have read the first 3. I haven't read Mistborn Era 2.
That's the important part that I'm talking about here. Because Mistborn comes off as a very different setting than what is set up by the time you get to the third book.
Yeah.
But it is clear that he had conceived of most of it before he wrote all 3. Because there's a lot of things going on that are just not explained. Right. Because there's very key setting details that are held back. And I think you make a good point in general. Depending on the length of the story that you need to tell, you have to do a lot more world building ahead of time. It also gives you a lot more opportunity to show off cool parts of your world. Because if you have a shorter story or just a one-off, there's just a lot of things you're never going to have time to get to, depending on how much world building you do.
Sure.
And that gets closer to the TTRPG space, where a lot of times you build this very cool setting, and the players only want to see B, but you did A through Z.
Yep.
So you just even if you really liked G, it's never coming.
It didn't come up.
Like, can you think of anything that you did world building wise in RPG that just never came, like that you wanted to go into, but the players weren't interested in? Or is that not how you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, a specific example I could think of was a fantasy setting that I did where, like, several centuries ago, like, orcs were the dominant species, so to speak, rather than sort of like the unintelligent, like, roving band that they're typically portrayed as.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And was hinted at during the course of the campaign, but then the campaign fizzled out before that actually went anywhere with it.
Was this one that I was in at all?
I believe you were, yes.
Was it the frigates and
It was.
Okay, because that, I will say, as a player, I thought the orcs were interesting, but we the campaign fizzled out. We only got to see them in like 1 or 2 scenes. It's like, oh yeah, there's some stuff over there that seems interesting. Yeah, that's a good. Especially if you can't finish a campaign. But in general, I feel like that's very common when, at least for me, in world building.
Oh, definitely. In terms, I mean, I've only run one mini campaign, and there were even in that, it was like the whole campaign took place in one very large build. Took place in a coliseum and kind of under the coliseum, and there was still stuff that I put in rooms and stuff that they were just like, yeah, we don't need to go in there. Yep. Okay.
I guess we'll never know.
Yeah, and characters that I had kind of fully fleshed out, and they just had no interest in talking to them.
Exactly.
And I think that's kind of, at least for me, that can be some of the fun bit of the world building. Is it's just world building in terms of it's just there to make the world feel lived in. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the plot or the story of the campaign. Like for mine, we did it over, I think, 4 sessions, so it was pretty tight. It wasn't entirely railroady, but it was kind of like, all right, there's like 3 different outcomes that you guys can get to, and that's about it, because you're in a very confined space, and we have a very confined time limit. So there was a lot of stuff that I put in there that is like, this isn't necessary. Everything that's necessary, I will make come up somehow.
Yeah, I'll force it in somehow. Yeah. But then you give a lot of backstory that doesn't need to be ever explored to characters. Yeah. It makes them feel a lot more real, and like the setting is... Yes. There are people's lives that are going on. Yep. Yeah, I feel like that is a very strong. That comes across very strongly if you handle it properly in RPGs. Yeah. But again, you're kind of at the whims of what your players find to be interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. So for me, there are 2 aspects if you're going to do that sort of world first style of storytelling / RPG writing. The first is enjoying the actual process of building a world in that manner of just saying, okay, even if this never gets seen, I at least get the fun of, okay, I get to name this pantheon, and I get to figure out this magic system, and all those little fun bits, which for some people are like, yeah, but I just want to roll dice and, have my players hack some monsters. Okay, that's fine. That's a completely different objective than what this is. And the second aspect of it is the satisfaction of knowing sometimes where there are things that the players will never see it, but what you are doing behind the screen is internally consistent with the world that you have built. It's like,
it's just very satisfying.
Yes. And so it's like, oh, I get to do this cool thing as a logical consequence of these premises that I've set up, and I'm not just making something up and flying by the seat of my pants because I think it would be cool.
Exactly.
Which is a fine way of, running a game. I have nothing against it.
Yes.
But it's not the same as the other way. If that's what you want, that's what you want.
Yep. Yes. And it is a uniquely fun feeling of setting up scenes that feel like you're making them up on the fly, but this was actually very well planned out. In the campaign that I did based on Avatar: The Last Airbender that Breilen was in. There was a fake prophecy that came up that I kept crowbarring into the story to make it seem as if I was just kind of rolling with it, but it was but behind the scenes, it was also intended to be crowbarred in. Like, it was very much a character trying to manipulate the characters. And so I liked how you guys didn't interface with it or didn't.
Yeah, we didn't really do anything with it. It was just like, oh, he's the chosen one? Neat. All right, whatever.
But that was intentional. It's like, hey, this is supposed to be like a what's going on situation. So it was very fun to play out that plot line when it was like, no, there was actually never anything going on. But I did intend that. I didn't just this didn't just fizzle out. It was never going it was never going where you were thinking.
It was always just kind of like, well, we're trying to force this in because the powers that be are trying to force it in.
Yes.
Yeah. And so it definitely felt like, man, he's really harping on this, and I don't really care. But all right.
So yeah, that's go ahead.
Well, one of the downsides of doing this story is here to conform to the world, right? It's a world first form, is that people don't actually care about your world.
No.
99% of the time. What people care about are the stories in the world. And so when you do world first focus, if you don't have the stories to back it up, then you have this thing that is really interesting only to you.
Right.
And it really depends on how that gets a lot into the actual craft of how you construct the world. Because if you, for example, construct a society and you are very clear to set up the cultural bit of the cultural phenomena around eating and meeting together and doing all these things, that in and of itself is not interesting.
Yeah.
But if you also construct it from the standpoint of a history or some story in the world building itself, then that stuff will seem a lot more interesting to your audience, whether that be players or readers.
Yeah, which is why like the Silmarillion is not to everybody's taste.
Sure.
But it does a much better job of explaining Tolkien's Legendarium than just here's a list of the Maiar, here's a list of the Valar, you know.
Yeah. I think the weaker parts of the Silmarillion are when it reads like a wiki article where it's just describing this character has these powers, this is where he came from.
Yeah.
Like, okay, cool.
There's very obvious in there, like, here's a story that Tolkien wrote, here's a story that Tolkien wrote, here's connective tissue that was kind of like scrap notes that he had, and we're just going to
put it in there.
We're going to fill the space in between these two. It's not as good.
And in a way, that is, some of the weakest parts of fitting a story to your world. When you have to, whether it be it's some in TTRPGs, but it's also a lot in writing.
I'd say it's a lot of writing.
You have to, a lot of times you have to get the reader up to speed somehow. But that can be really boring.
Yeah.
Hey guys, by the way, in our society, we only use our left hands because of blank and that. Actually, our right hands are evil. And you're like,
okay,
cool. I don't know why we decided to do that.
Yeah.
There are very cool ways in which you can explore that if you write it very well.
Yep.
But if you're not careful, it just feels like it's very prone to exposition dumps in either setting.
Yes. And I think in a lot of cases, it depends on what kind of time frame you're telling your story over. If you're doing this over, 10 novels that are each 40,000 words long. I'm mentioning an author that has been mentioned before today. Then like you can have little things that show up that are just kind of like, this is just a world thing. Like the women all hide one of their hands. Why? I don't know. I just kind of accept it as just like, that's the way the world is. It's mentioned, and it's just kind of like, this is a part of how the world works. It's not dumped on you. It's just, this is the way it is. And so things get complicated when you have to run a society holding with only one hand.
And the very interesting parts of that are when it actually influences what happens in the story.
When it actually
what happens with the characters. Story. It's like, oh, well, this character is very shy because for some reason she has both hands exposed. And that's very taboo.
Yeah.
Yes. Because if you just do it as, oh, here's a society, the women have one hand covered all the time. I'm like, okay, interesting point. Whatever. But then when it becomes, oh, this is actually an important part of the plot, and you set this up so many chapters ago, the payoff is so much more satisfying.
Yeah. And I think it works in a story of that length. It doesn't necessarily, like, if you've got a single novel and you're cramming all of these like minute societal details in, it just starts to feel bogged down where you're just like, I don't care.
Like, it's especially true when you start to look at the flip side. It's especially true of shorter stories. Like right now I'm working on a short story based on some magic system where math equals magic. It's a very cool concept in my mind.
Sure.
But it means that a lot of it, because it's a short story, it's so short, it's like a few pages long, I have to tailor the world building to tell the story I want to tell. So it's like, okay, this is how it works, not because this is the coolest way it could work, not because I spent a lot of time doing the entire history of the world, but because I wanted to tell a story about these characters, so I just built the world to fit that story that you only get to see this much of.
Right. So this is about the opposite of what we were just talking about.
Yes, the opposite of what we were of building a world just for your story.
Yeah.
Which I think can work really well, depending, especially if you have a story that you think is interesting, but the story itself didn't arise from you building a world. Like, you just had a story idea separate from it.
Yeah. And I think kind of going back with Tolkien as representing kind of a world existed and then he's telling stories within that.
Yes.
Another author in a similar vein, but doing the opposite, I would say would be Lewis with Narnia. I think he had a story he wanted to tell, very allegorical, and then crafted a world kind of around that story that fit the story that he wanted to tell. And then obviously as the books went on, they became more, okay, we've got an existing world that I kind of have to I have to obey the laws that I set up in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, it was very much this is the story that I want to tell.
Exactly.
And I want to put it in a world that's not this one.
And a lot of the books feel like he had to do all the world building all over again for the initial, like not Prince Caspian,
Horse and
His Boy.
Horse and His Boy feels very different.
It's like, okay, I want to tell this story, and so he built basically a second world within the world that already existed. That it used a bunch of tools that he had laid up beforehand, proper nouns, basically.
Yep.
Hey, this is a location.
Yep.
This is the name of a guy.
Yeah.
But then he could tell a whole new
That's
story.
more reuse than you get in some of the Ransom trilogy, where it's like,
Definitely.
well, this is just on completely different planets,
Yep.
so everything's different. All the rules are different. Society's completely different.
Oh, okay. I've only read the first one, so I don't know. That makes a lot of sense. Where it's like, it's just like
they're wildly different.
They're like, hey, actually, what if we did the same thing again?
It's not quite the same thing again.
It's basically we reuse the main character. That's about all we kept.
Okay, yeah. That I think that this way of telling stories definitely works.
Yeah.
It's a lot harder for TTRPGs because then you're basically railroading people. You're like, okay, this is the plot I want to do. Let me build a world to get me to that plot. It can have positives and negatives.
What I will say is, so the campaign that I was describing earlier that I ran in the previous segment of building a story to fit your world, I wrote that story as a novel first.
Yes.
And then had players kind of play through essentially the book that I had written. I expanded upon it a little bit and gave some branching paths. So it wasn't always just like, well, I've got to make sure they hit this beat and this beat and this beat, because if they don't, I've got nowhere for them to go.
Exactly.
But it was a story first campaign. I wrote all of this. The world building is there from the novel, but also just it was, this is the story that I want to tell, which I think both in novel writing and in TTRPGs works really well in short stories or one shots, where like a one shot, you kind of have to be a little bit railroady, where because it's not, we got 4 to 6 hours here. We're not gallivanting all across the continent.
Exactly. Actually, we wanted to go to a different setting entirely. Okay.
Cool. Well, I have nothing planned for that.
It also works really well for like lighthearted tabletop RPGs, where the players can accept, oh, we're not trying to portray the illusion of this massive in-depth world. We're here to drink beer, eat pretzels, and roll dice, and watch some monsters die.
Yep.
Yes.
I have a long time ago written an RPG system that was basically designed more or less around one shots of, okay, yeah, you're controlling like these little like vicious cat-like animals that have a half-life of like 10 minutes. So you're going to be re-rolling 3 or 4 characters in a 3-hour session.
Interesting.
Just because you just roll bad and okay, well, I guess my character's just at a roll a new one and he pops out of a nearby barrel or something. It's like the setting doesn't take itself seriously at all. And so if I'm trying to plan a mission, I don't need to think about, okay, so how does this world actually work? I think about, what sort of cool stuff do I want the players to be able to do? And then figure out how I contrive the world to now justify having those mechanics in place.
I played in a game similarly to that, where every game started and ended at the same tavern, and there's like a help board up on the desk or up on the wall, and it's just kind of like today's one shot essentially is you go to the board and go, we're gonna help this guy, and then you go find that guy and do what he says, and that's today's session. And there was some interwoven stuff, but there was no like big bad at the end or anything like that. It was all very much just kind of like, you're a group of guys at a tavern, and this is your job, and this is how you make money.
Exactly.
So that you can come back to the tavern and drink and then go out and do it again, and that's just your life.
I will say it does work okay in some longer stories too, like you mentioned Narnia. But the other one I would say is that where it's very clear that this is what was happening would be Star Wars.
Oh yeah,
I have that written down here. I was like, I want to touch on this.
It's like the first Star Wars movie, episode 4.
Very standalone.
And the world building is extremely light. You just need to know there's a desert and there's a lightsaber.
Yep.
There's a war.
It starts with an exposition dump.
It does.
Here's 3
do.
paragraphs of crawler.
And they went.
That's it.
And they went as far as to make it the Empire versus the Rebellion.
Yep.
Just the most generic two factions that you could have.
It's just like it's the evil empire. We're just
evil
gonna tell you straight up.
Yeah.
These
They're
are
the bad guys. They're the good guys.
And a lot of the imagery is just like, hey guys, remember World War II?
Yep.
But then we get to Empire Strikes Back, and suddenly there has to be actual world building to continue the story going on.
Yeah.
Like coming up with the whole idea of Darth Vader being Luke's father.
Right.
Just kind of was not in the first movie, but
Not
we
at all.
figured it out. I think it worked really well.
Yes.
To an extent. I think even when you get kind of see the cracks form even with the third movie.
Oh, definitely.
Jedi has some things where it's like even Luke and Leia being siblings are like, this is not really set up ahead of time.
No.
Doesn't have a lot of bearing on the world.
No.
And then we don't need to go beyond that. The world building fell apart when it got beyond that.
Yeah.
But for the world of those three movies, it worked super well. And by doing it that way, it also worked out where he didn't actually go into a lot of detail. There's a lot of room for you to just come up with stuff that would be fun.
Which is why, I mean, prior to Disney acquiring it, there were books and books and books and books of people writing stuff in this world because it's so rules light.
Exactly. And there's just like a lot of cool touchstones that you want to reuse, but you don't actually have a rigid system where there's a history that it goes back 500 years in detail.
Yeah.
So that you can't really tell a story.
You get a little bit. You get like, there was a High Republic. That is all you get. You get there were these two words. You have no idea what it means.
But it sounded cool.
But it sounded glorious.
You could look at the opposite side, like you can't do the same things with Lord of the Rings that you can with Star Wars.
Sure.
Because it is a lot more rigid in terms of Tolkien was very clear as far as like what the ages were and even what took place in the ages.
Sure. And that's actually a really good example, I think, because as we have like all of these new Star Wars movies and these new Star Wars TV shows coming out, you can argue whether they're good or not, but they follow the rules of Star Wars. They fit into the Star Wars world. I would argue that the Rings of Power is not a Lord of the Rings TV show. It doesn't follow the rules of the books. And
it's very hard to do that though, because there's not a lot of space
to
tell a story.
Just tell your own story.
So I would actually disagree on the Star Wars premise.
Oh, interesting.
Because while from my very shall we say, shallow movie-going experience. The prequels, I was okay with as far as world building. Again, not speaking to the quality of movies. Mm-hmm. But I actually think that the world building, especially in The Last Jedi, and then also in what was the ninth one?
Rise of Skywalker?
Rise of Skywalker. Yep. The world building in those, actually, I had significant problems with because it felt like all of this world building that we had before we're now just contradicting or throwing out the window. In addition to the story not being very good.
Right. And I would agree. I don't know that I would I can't come up with anything that's necessarily contradicting. I guess force healing is a little bit of a issue.
The force the one that people complain about, I believe, is called the Holdo maneuver.
Oh yeah,
where you can. When the admiral has her just fly all the ships through the other ships in hyperspace.
Right.
But but there is a throwaway line to say, "Wow, that was like 1 in a million, guys." Totally not a contradiction.
Yeah,
it's just hard to do.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and even that, it's not necessarily contradicting stuff in the past that said you couldn't do this.
Right.
It just wasn't done. We didn't have suicide bomber X-wings.
Right.
But you could also just use autopilot.
Sure.
Or you have the First Order coming out. It's like, where did these guys come from?
Yeah,
like
that
how
I would say, okay, especially the sequel movies. That's where I was kind of hinting at that Star Wars did an amazing job in the original trilogy, and it excited a lot of people's minds. And so there's a lot of the stuff based on a lot of it is the original trilogy. The sequel movies completely annihilated a lot of the coherency. They also had to throw away a lot of the canon, which makes sense because there was too much. It's very similar to Lord of the Rings. They had covered everything.
Yeah.
We knew exactly how it worked.
Yeah.
There's not room to tell a news story. So they had to throw it away. I would even argue personally that the prequels did a lot of damage to the world building because it stopped making sense.
Yeah.
Especially with like the Jedi love thing. It was like, this does not work anymore.
Yeah.
And also midichlorians. This doesn't work very well anymore because the spirituality is now kind of lost.
Yeah.
You just have force in you. And for some reason, we can perpetuate the Jedi without marrying, and this just kind of anyway. I felt like the prequels had a lot of cool ideas that they trafficked, but they also did too much world building. Like, they did too much explaining.
Yeah, and I think my point was less, is it good world building or bad world building? Yes. I think, generally speaking, the Star Wars prequels, sequels, TV shows, etc., are fairly consistent.
Fair.
They all, like, there might be minute things that go, okay, they added this thing that not necessarily doesn't work with stuff in the past, but makes me go, why didn't anybody ever do this?
Yes.
Right.
And the answer could just be nobody did, or nobody thought of it. Sure, eventually at some point somebody has to be the first to do something.
It's true.
So it's not necessarily inconsistent.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the Rings of Power, I just go, this is inconsistent with the world that was created, which, granted, much harder to do because the world that was created is very, very in depth. And so if you're not very familiar with it, you can easily come up with stuff where it's just like, this doesn't make sense with the world. Either it completely contradicts things that we know happened, or it just, the vibe is wrong. Whereas with the Star Wars stuff, good or bad, I feel like the world building fits. It all feels Star Wars-y.
Okay. So I would have a few counter arguments to that. So the first is, so contradictory world building is bad world building, but there is non-contradictory world building that is also bad.
Correct.
Okay.
And I think that's where things like the sequels fall into okay, this doesn't explicitly contradict established rules, but it does raise a lot of eyebrows of, okay, so why
did this never happen?
Why did this never happen? The answer is, well, it never happened because the world is serving the story, and because this is fitting with the theme of the story. And that's sort of my understanding of our argument is like, this fits with the story vibe, right? And so in that sense, we're all very consistent of, we all have the same story vibe, even if it's not all the exact same story.
Right.
And so they're all portraying the world subservient to that story vibe.
Yeah.
Which is fine as far as it serves the story. I still don't think it's good world building.
Oh, I agree.
You can have the story.
Yeah.
Story can be great outside of it.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the new Star Wars stuff feels very, very much like fan fiction of, like, these are people. Yeah. These are people who, give them the benefit of the doubt, they appreciate or love the world that they're creating in. They're bad writers. They're bad. They're not good at the world building aspect, but they understand Star Wars. They understand how Star Wars functions.
In a way, it's actually not necessarily their fault, because at the risk of saying something unpopular, I don't know if the world building of Star Wars is actually that good, even in the original trilogy.
No, it's very, very light.
But they do very good lore building. Like, there's a lot of lore. There's a lot of just like general. There's a feeling that it is so broad and there's so much going on that is exciting. And there's like all the stuff you want to explore, even though most of it, when it is explored, is not very
that interesting.
Good or very interesting. And so a lot of these people are super consistent with the lore of Star Wars and with the world building.
Yep.
It's just that when we start to expand it, suddenly the Republic is not as cool as it was when we just heard about it as like a long distant thing a long time ago.
Whereas I would say the Rings of Power feels like it is written by somebody who maybe read The Hobbit and then watched the movies when they were 10 and are now trying to write something in their 40s.
Yeah, and someone on staff was like,
you don't know what you're doing.
And someone on staff was like, hey, so I read the Silmarillion, here's a list of names and general ideas we could use.
Right.
So I have not seen The Rings of Power.
Don't watch it.
Okay. Okay. But like, is it straight up like, you actually have this thing that just flat out contradicts what's already established in the Silmarillion? Or is it more of a, well, okay, I can see where you would make this argument, but it on the surface still seems to be a contradiction that you're just trying to hand wave away?
There's a lot of it is just, we have a history and this isn't it. Okay. You're saying that this is taking place at this time, and Tolkien had dates, and this is how it all went down. This character doesn't exist. This character isn't involved here. this character does exist and isn't here for whatever reason. So that kind of thing of just like
this has to be an alternate timeline.
It has to be an alternate timeline,
Yeah.
and even that I can kind of excuse, where it's just like, okay, there you can have some creative license with that. It's an immense world. The movies don't perfectly encapsulate the Lord of the Rings books. There's too much there. The thing that really bothered me was when elves who were there at the first kinslaying started to go, you know what? Lying is a good idea. Let's just lie to get what we want. And it's like, no, this is how you all died in the past. And you all said, we're never doing this again. And that's where it's just like, okay, so this is just not, these aren't Tolkien's elves anymore.
Yeah.
Right. So Zay, you mentioned something earlier about the world building versus the lore building.
Yes.
What do you mean by lore building?
So
That's an interesting term.
That's a thing, right? So we have world building. We defined world building on the first podcast. I'm gonna be honest, I don't remember the exact definition. We did define it.
Yep.
But there's a lot of different things that could be called world building. And part of it has to do with the internal lore and history of the world, which is separate from the world building that you do.
Yeah.
And also, there's the what is exposed versus not exposed, but we can get to that in a second. But in general, does anyone want to talk on that some about the difference between setting up your lore versus actually world building?
The simple difference for me would be world building are the facts of my world.
Yes.
And lore building is the history as it is known by the people that you're encountering, whether they're, characters or NPCs or the player characters. Lore building is kind of, okay, this is, we're in a world where there are 5 different pantheons of gods. Only one of them is actually real, or maybe none of them are real. Maybe there's one deity and everybody is kind of like, well, we're just all pantheistic, and that's how we all remember it. Or we've got this event in the past that everybody kind of remembers, but it was 2,000 years ago, and these people kind of remember it that way. Yeah. Those people kind of remember it that way, and that it kind of shifts. That to me is lore building, where it has much more to do in lore building is much more in the here and now, and world building is kind of like, I am the god of this universe, and this is the way that the world is.
So would world building be something like, hey, we have these magical wizards who fight with glow sticks and can throw rocks around with their minds, and lore building is a character saying, oh, I thought they were just a myth?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly. Even though it was less than 100 years ago. But it was
I was going to gloss over that. I was just going to let that one lie.
Let that one go.
Not less than 100, less than like 30.
30, yeah. It's one generation.
But no, it's true. And
there are people around who saw them.
But honestly, to the point that we were making earlier, talking about people don't care about your world building, they care about the story bit. In a lot of ways, they care more about the lore building, like what is known to other people.
Absolutely.
Especially in RPGs, because you are a character in the world, you play as one, and so you share in the common lore of everyone else to an extent, because the GM has to actually tell you that. You don't know it. But that is the part that the reader, the player, most directly interfaces with. Yeah. Because unless you're going really old school, you don't just come in and say, and by the way, Omniscient Worldview, just so you guys know, that's not real. There's actually no gods here. Just wanted to let you know. Yeah. Now continue on the story. Yeah. That part you usually don't get the back scenes and the backstory on that. You still have to be in a point of view that's in the story itself. Yeah.
And a lot of stories, I would say, you work your way to that God perspective, where at the beginning you're kind of like, I don't know, me as the reader, I don't know anything about how the world works, and so I'm working with a character that also doesn't have a full comprehension of how the world works. And then as the story builds and progresses, they get a little bit more of an understanding about this facet, and it becomes a little bit clearer. And we get a little bit more over here, and then maybe we come back to this and we go, oh, some of what we thought about this is actually wrong, but here's the right bit, and it gets a little bit clearer even more so, and you kind of build that way.
The outsider POV really helps a lot.
Right. Well, so unless you do Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss, where the first 50 pages or so is basically just a giant lore dump.
Oh, interesting.
But it's told basically from the perspective of a character who knows all this, but doesn't want everybody else around him to know it.
Interesting.
And so everybody else in the village is observing these things going on, and they all have their interpretations about what it is that's filtered through the lore of the village that's been handed down for the past 500 years. And as a character who knows what's actually going on, trying to make sure that, demons don't take over the village or whatever, but not trying to scare everybody in the process.
Sure.
And so he's not always very clear to the audience about what he's doing, because to him, his audience is the people of the village. So it's like, okay, you know what's going on here, but you're still not telling me. So I'm still in the dark, even though the main character isn't.
Sure.
Yes. I thought that's a very well done story, and he's very intentional with the framing of what is and isn't lore, what is and isn't known, and about characters being in the know versus not in the know. So that is a very good way that you can expose things to the audience, but also let them know that there's more going on than what they're seeing.
Yes.
Were you saying?
No, I have not read that book, so I don't necessarily have anything to contribute there. But what I was going to bring in is, I mean, we get this anytime we have multiple POVs in a book where you've got different characters that know different things, but we as the audience know everything that all of the characters know to an extent.
And so you can hide certain details with certain characters and have them be more engrossed in the lore, rather than just having a story. In a lot of cases, you have to do it where you have the protagonist is an outsider coming into the world, just like the audience, so they can be the audience stand-in. Luke doesn't know anything about Jedi. He's a moisture farmer, so he doesn't know a lot about the lore. He just kind of gets brought in like we do. But you don't have to do it that way. You can have insiders and outsiders, and it's done to differing degrees depending on how far you want to take the idea. But yeah,
you can also have the pseudo insider. Like, you can have your Han Solo who knows a whole lot about this particular aspect of the world and will share what he knows. But then you have your Obi-Wans who are maybe a little bit more reserved in what they give out, even though they know a whole lot more that's actually important to what's going on.
Yeah, it's true. I think the flip side of this, though, is to the experience of throwing the audience in and having them figure it out as they go along can be enjoyable, depending on the degree you do it to. Yeah. Especially because the world does feel so much richer if you've done a lot of lore building without giving exposition. Because, again, to go to the example you used earlier, you were talking about Stormlight Archives with a lot of that is like, hey, just so you guys know, we all cover our left hands or whatever. That's just, you're just expected to know this. Yeah. They don't ever explain it in any amount of detail. There's a lot of details that are just kind of given out. And now, later on, they might get explained, but people don't think about these things. It does make the world feel like it's lived in. And like, this is not just Earth with a different coat of paint. There are clear differences to how this affects people. It just takes a lot of work to build that lore building, and you have to be really careful about exposing enough detail to where people are not completely lost.
That particular detail I find to be a very interesting example of world building, because it's one of those things that's very similar enough to so many things that we already observe in real life societies that you can read that and be like, okay, this seems like this is a thing that a society would do. I buy it. But it also has the possibility that you have an in-universe reason for how this tradition came about that dates back 500 or 1,000 years or whatever that might become plot relevant 4 books down the line. And whether it does or it doesn't, it's still a good story and a good world that you're building.
Right.
Yeah. Another example that I think does it really, really well is Dune, where you're just kind of you're just thrown into the world, and in that instance, it's even like all of the characters have a lot of in-depth world knowledge that you are not given.
Yeah.
And you're just kind of like they just say stuff because they don't think of in their day-to-day, they're not thinking or talking of like, here, let me exposit this to you, Father.
Oh,
here's
yes,
how
the
this
Bene
works.
Gesserit.
Right, like that. It's just like this is how this world works. We all know it, and so we're not necessarily talking about it, but we as the audience don't, and so it's kind of like the world unfolds as you read, and I very much appreciate that.
And he also did a very good job of focusing you on the details that the characters don't know, because Paul and Jessica. Is it Jessica? Thank you. Yeah, Paul and Jessica are unfamiliar with Arrakis and the world they're going into, and so that is told to them repeatedly. Okay, this is how it works.
This is how it works. This is what you need to be aware of. This is how this works. This is what we do here.
And then there's places where they don't know things, just like the audience, and they feel awkward.
Yep.
But then you're also expected to know all this external detail that you don't have yet. That does feed well into the story. So it's a good contrast with using both tools.
That's also, Dune is one of those stories where a large portion of the story is also the discovery of the world.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Whereas there are a lot of other stories where those are two separate things.
Yep.
Like you don't really need to discover a lot about the world in the process of Lord of the Rings, as much as once you get out of the council, we know what the story's about.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Everything else is just a means to that end.
Yeah.
And so if you want to get really into this world, you can do that. But it's sort of running down a separate track of the story. With Dune, the story is the discovery of the world. So it's very hard to disentangle those two in a discussion of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess what I like that I think Dune does is Dune feels like it is a story told to somebody who lives in the universe of Dune.
Mm-hmm.
Where it's like, I'm not going to give you this detail because everybody knows this detail.
Yes.
You as the reader actually don't, and you'll get it later on when it just comes up naturally of just like, oh yeah, this is just the way that this kind of thing works. And that's everybody knows it. Didn't really bring it up at that point. We're bringing it up now because it has some relevance to what's going on.
Right. Nobody stops and says, hey, I'm really glad that we have these people who can replace the function of computers for us.
Right.
It takes quite a bit to kind of figure, okay, that's what
exactly. You kind of piece it together as you go, and there's very little in-depth, lengthy text of exposition then because you aren't given it. You don't get exposited to. It's just, this is the way that it is, and you'll figure it out later.
Yeah.
And I greatly appreciate that.
The books and the movies, they do a very good job of integrating the world building into the storytelling, and showing you the details slowly over time.
Yep.
I think that can be some of the most challenging stuff in general about world building and about smashing together your world building with the actual story that you're doing.
Sure.
Because when it comes to actually creating, either in writing or in TTRPGs or any of this stuff, at a certain point, you do have to actually expose this to the audience.
Yes.
They can't, as for all the stuff we've said about the richness that can be in the background and about the enjoyment of the process itself, which is true, when it comes time to the story, you have to actually get these details to them somehow. You have to actually have the players understand what's going on well enough for them to take their part in the story and to take the pieces you have and run with them.
Yeah.
So any ideas? Let's start with TTRPGs. Are there things in general that you have found have been useful for actually integrating the world building into the storytelling?
That's a question for not me, because I'm by far the least experienced in that realm.
Mm-hmm.
I think for me, just in terms of what I have done as far as prepping for one that I'm going to start running next month, is a lot of the storytelling ahead of time stuff that I'm doing has to do with what the players have given me as far as backstory is concerned, and going, okay, cool, I've got this bit and this bit. How do I connect them, either one to something that is involved very explicitly with kind of the main plot of what's going on in the world, or how do I connect it immediately to another player or something like that. And so that's what I'm working on right now, having not actually started, is just how do I integrate these characters into the world so that they are a more significant part of what's going on in the world, rather than just Farmer Bob who's out taking care of his turnips, and that's his life in the world of Dungeons and Dragons. But as far as once you actually get going, I would love to hear what you guys have to say on that.
Yeah, so for me, one of the things that I learned while GMing is a lot. I'll bring this out to the general, but in the specific, if you're describing a dungeon, if you don't say something, it doesn't exist.
Yes.
Right? Okay, it's a dungeon with walls, and if I don't tell you anything about the actual walls of the dungeon, then the players can't interact with it.
Yeah.
And that also applies to the story of, okay, if I don't tell you like anything about the pantheons in the system, the players can't fill that in or infer it. Now, you don't have to necessarily always say it directly.
Yes.
Sure.
But if you're going to tell it, you need to, if you want them to know it, you need to at least tell it indirectly.
Yes.
And if you're going to do it indirectly, probably multiple times and in multiple ways, so that it's not just, oh, there was this one thing. I wonder if it means this. Because once, as a player, you've made that leap several times and you've been wrong, you tend to assume that if you're inferring off of hints that the GM is throwing out, that my guess is probably wrong until you get multiple, oh, okay, he's actually telling me something this, but he's not saying it explicitly.
Gotcha.
Yes. No, that's a very good point. In general, you have to tell people, it especially gets hard when it's something that is considered mundane in the world or to the people around, but you need them to know that this is not, hey, this thing is going on. This guy has a third eye. Now, all the people around him don't think about that, but if you don't tell them that, then what are you going to come back later? Oh, by the way, they all had 3 eyes, and you're supposed to ask for description of that. Like, what is
right? And for some of that sometimes, in the case of running a TTRPG, is have your players actually have some, basically like a handout about the setting or something like that. Of maybe what I'm going to tell you is not necessarily objectively true from the world building that we're doing together, but it's going to be at least be, this is how your character would probably perceive the things that you're going to observe.
Yes.
So that way you know how you want to be reacting to these things that are being portrayed in front of you. So that way, when the guy with 3 eyes shows up and nobody else is blinking, your character could also be like, oh yeah, it's just a triclops. What's the big deal?
Yeah, that's...
I went to school with one when I was younger.
I'm not a racist. Yeah. No, that's a very good point. And about exposing them to these ideas in a very controlled environment. In TTRPGs, you just have to kind of tell people. It's especially true if you're running anything in like an existing setting. It's like, look, your character would know what a Jedi is.
Right.
They would just know that.
Yeah.
I don't need to explain that versus the things that you do actually have to surface during gameplay. I think it's true in writing as well. Of like, you have to be very intentional about showing things, about exposing things. And it kind of depends in that sense, both for constructing TTRPGs and writing. In my experience, it depends a lot on your approach in general. Because if you're someone who does a lot of planning and does a lot of planning out everything you're going to do, you probably need to, at the planning stage, think about how you're going to show this stuff off.
Yeah.
For me, in a lot of cases, if I do the homework, if I actually spend the time and do the world building and build the lore, it's very easy to expose that during the process of either writing it or in the game. For GMing, it's so much easier if I already have that figured out to find places to put it in rather than having to always plan out everything because I already know what's going on. And so it's very easy to fill in the detail. It's very hard to do that stuff on the fly if you didn't do the homework and actually build all this stuff out. Then it's a lot harder to know what do I need to tell the players versus what I don't. But if you're very clear on what's happening, at least in my case, you know what to actually show people because you know what's important.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think with the writing aspect anyway, I think there's more space, at least in some instances, for leaving things up to your audience's interpretation.
Yeah.
Whereas, in a TTRPG setting, you kind of need at least everyone in the party to be on the same page. You can't have, well, half of the people thought of it this way and half of the people thought of it this way. And it's actually really important that you all think about it this third way.
Exactly.
Because if you don't, we're all missing out.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in, kind of going back to, we've talked about this hand thing with Brandon Sanderson's books of like, if everybody has a different headcanon of why the women have to hide one of their hands, it's fine.
Yeah.
It's like, cool.
Doesn't change anything.
If down the road he wants to be like, well, here's the actual reason why, then sure. But as far as like...
But then that'll invalidate all of my fan fiction.
Well...
Yeah.
That's a little uncomfortable.
Sorry, man. It's just how it is. I mean...
Yeah,
the headcanon was right. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and I'm sure there are some people who feel that way, but I think with writing, there's more space for that to
for
be
leaving
the
the
case.
unknown.
Even when like the actual answer is important,
Mhm.
because you're going to be informed of it when it matters.
Yes.
Right now, it doesn't matter, and so I'm not told, and most of the characters also don't know. So
Mhm.
you're not feeling like, oh, there's like this thing going on that everybody's kind of in on and I'm not. And so I feel like excluded randomly.
Yes.
And then when it becomes important, then everybody, both in the world and all of the readers, go, oh, this is why this has been a thing. This now it all
Yes.
makes sense with all of this stuff going back books and books and books and books.
Yeah. Like even in the case of something like Dune, at first it feels like the sandworms are just like, okay, it's a cool thing.
Yeah.
I'll just fill in the details of why these are here and the relevance because they're just kind of cool. They're kind of interesting. As the story goes on, it's like, no, they're actually relevant.
Integral to the plot.
And you're like, oh, okay, now I get it. But
This is why one of Sanderson's laws of magic. It's the one about how the ability for the author to use magic to solve a problem is directly proportional to how well the reader understands said magic.
Yeah.
Not how well the characters understand said magic.
Yes.
And that distinction is very important
to an
especially when it
extent
comes to world building.
Because I think you can have a light magic system that is fine.
You can.
Like that's most of the magic in Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
The audience has no idea.
Yeah,
how
you don't really know
what
how
Gandalf
it
would
works,
do.
but it's just like, oh, Gandalf, he did this thing and magic happened, and isn't that wonderful? Because Gandalf's so great, and that's kind of like I'm very content with that. When it becomes a problem is when you have a very in-depth magic system like Sanderson is a fan of, and then rules get broken without you knowing, and you're like,
That is a problem.
That shouldn't be able to happen.
And it extends to the world building too. Of like, guys, I mean, if the sandworms start talking, I don't know this. This was explained. They're an animal. I don't get it. I'm lost.
Right.
You can't just switch this up on me. Oh yeah, well they just talk to the sandworms.
Yeah.
And then what are we doing? Like you have to actually explain things if you want the world to be an integral part of solving a problem in the story. It's like, well, otherwise you're just making it up.
Stuff is just happening, and it doesn't. As an audience, it feels inconsequential and cheap.
Yeah,
because it's just kind of like, oh well, you just did a thing that was convenient.
Even if it wasn't, even if you technically did build it up, and even the characters understood that this could be done, if you don't tell the audience, it just doesn't feel. It feels very cheap.
It's true. Well, I mean, any sufficiently advanced sandworm is indistinguishable from magic.
It's true. When you get to a certain point, it's like, they're just magical.
Everything's magic.
Yes. So it's
so the rule still applies.
In the hardest of hard sci-fi, where you have deep world building, if you don't explain it, it's just the magic.
It's just magic. Yeah.
Yeah, they magic the solution. So that's just how it goes.
The magic is just coding.
Yeah. Well, I think we should probably wrap up.
Sounds good to me.
There's still a lot of stuff you can go over here, but that's why we still have a podcast. We don't have to shut down early, guys. We can get to 3 episodes at least.
Yeah. We'll make it.
We'll make it.
Probably.
Lord willing. There's a lot of things I want to. There's a lot of things on this that I would want to keep going on, but we'll leave it for another time. So, any more thoughts before we close out? Anybody want to get something off?
I'm happy with where we're ending. I think that's a nice place to stop.
I'm still on team world building.
I'm probably on team storytelling. So.
I was gonna say I like storytelling.
Yeah.
But world building is also fun. Yeah. All right. Corner table podcast. We'll see you guys later.
Bye.
Peace.